This week, we tackle one of the Bible's most familiar stories by asking the questions we usually skip. Why did the disciples simply leave Jesus behind? Why did Peter think walking on water was a good test? What does this little faith really mean? Maybe faith grows more like learning to ride a bike than passing a test. Come explore Matthew's story with fresh eyes and renewed hope. I opened up the lessons this week and saw Elijah greeting me and the still small voice story, and I thought, there's a good story. Then I took a look at the second lesson and saw, for everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. But how are they to call on the one who they have not believed? And how are they to believe in one of whom they have not heard? And how are they to hear without someone to proclaim him? And how are they to proclaim him unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. Well, that could be a good fertile start. I didn't want to jump the gun, so I opened up the gospel, and there it was, the post-feeding of the multitude story that's just sort of laid in there. Most of the headings in Bibles that have headings simply say, Jesus walks on water. Well, my first inclination was to head back up to the other lessons because, like the feeding of the multitude, I've confronted it many, many times. But I thought, and I decided to run through it and just let me be me in reading it. Let all of my questions out and read it like a first-timer. And I found the whole thing confusing, and I wanted to dig deeper. Well, what you've just heard, I wrote before I began to study. I thought it might help me to keep me honest to the process. And here's the things that grabbed me and made me dig deeper. So from the beginning of last week's gospel, where Jesus was just trying to grieve the execution of his cousin John, nothing has changed. He has simply delayed his grief response to help the multitude of people. When the day is pretty much over, he finally hits that point of everyone just please go so I can be alone. I get that. But the Sea of Galilee is like 8 miles wide, and he's like, I'm just going to hang here. No one is bothered by that. What was his plan? Evidently to walk 8 miles across the water, but no one was like, well, how do we know when to come back to pick you up? Or how will we find you? Do you have the Uber boat app? Wait, there are no apps or phones or GPS. Could you hire a boat or catch a ride somehow? It just seems like it was just, yeah, okay. Catch you on the other side, Jesus. Well, they leave and get caught in a storm. You can go on YouTube and you can see storms on the Sea of Galilee. They are bad news. So by the time frame we are given, they've spent some serious time in the dead of night fighting this thing. The next thing that happens is Jesus walking to them on the water. They're getting all blown around, but he finds them. And that's pretty awesome. But then I have more questions. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, it's a ghost. And they cried out in fear. Well, that makes all the sense in the world to me. Jesus tells them, though, not to worry because it's him. Well, all I can think is that if it were some sort of malevolent ghost as they think it is, and as I would think, I would say, well, that's exactly what an evil ghost would say. But then Peter answers him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. What? Peter, what are you doing? That's not how you test these things out. At least ask him his mother's maiden name. Right here, Peter's faith is pretty impressive. I think he probably has some sort of recognition. He gets out and he goes walking on the water. He does it. which is amazing that he would have even considered getting out of the boat in the first place. But then it says, then he noticed the wind. Wait, you mean the one they had been fighting for hours? That happens and he starts sinking? Then Jesus says, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Now, how is that fair? And it concludes with them believing. Them believing makes sense after what they've seen, but I don't get the other parts. It makes the story hard to relate to for me. And I guarantee if a pastor of 30 years is like, others will be also. So I investigated. There's not much that really answers some of those earlier questions. Matthew simply doesn't tell us how the disciples expected to reconnect with Jesus. Maybe they assumed he'd find another boat. Maybe they thought he'd stay the night and catch up later. Matthew isn't interested, though, in the travel arrangements, so I guess I shouldn't worry too much about that for too long. Well, as for the ghost thing, the disciples aren't being irrational. They've been fighting a violent storm in the middle of the night for hours. Then they see a human figure walking across the waves. It's a ghost. Is actually a pretty reasonable first reaction. Jesus answers, take heart, it is I. Peter isn't fully convinced, but given his track record, he wants it so bad. He wants to be a good disciple. He always seems to want a chance to prove himself. Notice he still says, Lord, if it is you. So he asks for the only test he knows. He doesn't ask Jesus to identify himself with secret information. He asks Jesus to command him because I think Peter has learned that when Jesus commands the impossible becomes possible. And that's exactly what happens. Peter climbs out of the boat and starts walking on the water. Then it's not like he just notices the wind and the violent water. It's that his attention is turned toward them. When I thought about it, this is the part that really grabbed me. I so remember times where I was learning something new and I would start to get it. Something just clicks out of nowhere and you're suddenly riding the bike by yourself and no one's hanging on to the bike. Or you're suddenly playing something you've struggled with on the guitar and your mind goes, wait, how am I doing this? And you crash or your fingers can't hit the strings right for anything. It takes muscle memory. Maybe that's the little or immature faith we're talking about in the gospel. Why didn't I just keep playing the song or pedaling? Why did you doubt? It becomes a reasonable question. You see, psychologists have even given a name for the phenomenon. Paralysis by analysis. Skills that need to become embodied can break down when conscious control suddenly takes over. The parent says, you were riding, why'd you stop? Muscle memory isn't developed, though, by never wobbling or crashing. It's developed by wobbling, recovering, falling, getting back on until trust becomes embodied. Peter's story doesn't end in the water. Jesus catches him. The lesson isn't terminated by failure. For this part of Peter's journey, Jesus uses the term little faith rather than no faith. And here's a cool thing. Matthew is the mustard seed gospel. In chapter 13, Jesus talks about a little seed becoming a big plant. And then in chapter 17, he tells them the wonders of having faith the size of a mustard seed. Here's the deal. I am not Angus Young or Eddie Van Halen or Randy Rhoads or Roy Clark, famous guitar players. They have all achieved top-level abilities on the guitar through practice and years of muscle memory. They don't even have to look down at the fretboard anymore. Yet I should not be upset at being called a novice or being told that I have a little bit of skill. The important thing is to stay on the journey and to build our muscle memory, whether it's riding a bike, playing an instrument, or developing our faith. I kind of wonder if Simon got the name Peter because of this event, as Matthew is recording the events much, much later in time. Peter means rock, and boy did he sink like one that day. And that's kind of the nicknaming or renaming thing that guys do for one another. But remember later Jesus tells him that he is Peter, and on this rock he will build his church? It also says a wise person builds their house upon a rock. Maybe that's the invitation in this story. Not to beat ourselves up because our faith isn't yet the faith of a saint who has walked with Christ for decades, but to recognize that little faith is still faith. It gets out of the boat. It wobbles. It falls. It cries out, Lord, save me. And every single time, Jesus reaches out his hand. That's how little faith becomes mature, steadfast faith. Not by never struggling, but by discovering over and over again that Christ is faithful, even when we're still learning to trust. Amen.